Hey friends, Forrest Inslee here with a quick note about this podcast episode. We'll be talking about a workbook that we at Circlewood have turned into an online self-paced course. If you like what you hear in the conversation, we want to offer the course to you for free. I'll give you details about signing up for the course at the end of the episode. Enjoy! Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. In this episode, we talk with Liuan Huska about her work with what she calls liturgies of restoration. Commissioned by the Au Sable Institute, Liuan has developed a workbook, which is now the basis of a course, one that helps people to explore how habits of thought and action shape our character and inform the larger stories we tell ourselves, especially as they relate to our relationship with creation and our role as earthkeepers.
What are the stories that our faith tells us about who we are? And then what are the habits and postures of heart that come out of that? And then working backwards and saying, well, we know these are the stories, these are the truths that we want to be living out on a day-to-day basis, but we can't live them out without concrete action. So what habits can we practice to form ourselves into people that really live that story and embody that story? Our call as worshipers of God has to be put in relationship with our call to care for creation.
Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Welcome to the podcast. It's good to have you with us. I'm wondering if you could orient our listeners by telling us what it is that you do day to day.
So I'm a freelance writer, and I write for various Christian publications and secular publications, but I have a book that deals with reconciling body and spirit in chronic pain and illness that came out last year called Hurting Yet Whole. Since I published that book, as I've just absorbed climate news, the news about environmental degradation, and just been in my little corner of the church, seeing what things are like on the ground, I've felt motivated to turn more of my writing towards environmental issues and creation care issues. So that's how I got connected with Au Sable Institute to do some spiritual formation materials development writing for their program.
I want to follow up on that shift in interest to be wanting to write about more ecological concerns. What caused that shift? How did that come up in you, this sort of new desire to maybe advocate for creation?
I think it's a natural outgrowth of, I've been writing on issues of embodiment, and so how our bodies are part of our spiritual lives, not just when they're well, but when they're hurting too, and how by paying attention to our limits, places where we feel vulnerable, and maybe not living up to like the capitalist ideal of, being a productive member of society in times of illness and pain, that our bodies are still telling us things about God and who we are if we're able to pay attention. So I think out of that concern and care for our bodies as part of creation, part of the good thing that God has given us in this world, that extends to the body of the earth. And so seeing so much climate news of the body of the earth hurting, animals and plants and ecosystems hurting, I really wanted to respond to that. It's kind of like an existential moment. And I think along with many people in my generation, I would call myself a millennial. I feel a lot of eco-anxiety and climate despair, and feel like the churches that we're part of are a little bit behind where we are with knowing how to respond or even wanting to respond at all. to these concerns. So yeah, I really wanted to start writing to a church audience, but also to a larger audience, connecting spirituality and ecology.
I'm curious about this phrase you used, climate despair and eco-anxiety. It seems to me that your generation actually has to struggle with something that probably older generations don't quite understand. But I also see that is having a positive impact in that so many of your generation are finding ways to turn their vocations in ways that actually serve the environmental movement or oppose climate change or work for ecological justice. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that. What has that been like for you? And maybe even comment about your generation in terms of the response that is possible to that despair.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're going to be being on this planet for a few decades longer than previous generations. We're having children. I have 3 children who are 2, 4, and 7. So I'm thinking about the climate projections of what the temperatures will be like in 2050 or beyond if we don't reach the Paris climate agreements, those carbon emissions caps. And I'm thinking about what they're going to see, what the world that they're getting ready for, or that I'm preparing them for. And so, yes, it definitely feels like there's a lot of responsibility, like we're the generation who's going to be kind of stepping into these positions of leadership, but also, yes, a lot of anger at previous generations. I think there's a lot of, why didn't you guys deal with this sooner? You knew about this, but you just continue to do what you've always done. I think because we're maybe a little bit less ingrained in certain career tracks. Like for me, I'm still at the beginning of my career. It's a little easier to like switch gears and say, well, I'm going to turn towards doing what I was doing, but in a way that serves the environment. That is honestly a big help for eco-despair, is doing something about it, acting on it.
It's been a bit sad to watch my daughter's generation, and a lot of her friends have actually decided that while they hold on to hope and actually are engaging in actions that actually help, they're also making decisions. And for example, many will say that it's not a viable option to have children because they don't want their children to be facing the costs that are to come. So I'm not sure really how to respond to that. In fact, I would say that I'm hoping that means that it's going to translate into something really creative and constructive in terms of finding ways forward. But some days I find it hard to hope, to be honest. Luann, I'm curious, your generation obviously has a keen sensibility of our current Earth crisis, and I'm wondering, when you are doing your work of writing about the environment, do you find that you have support, that community around you that affirms the things that you care about, or do you struggle with that sense of being alone sometimes?
I hop around several different Christian circles, and some are more evangelical, some are more progressive, and everywhere in between. And I've also found a lot of nourishment from indigenous spirituality and connecting with communities that do their work out of that perspective. So I think I've had to work to find the support, and it's not necessarily come from the faith communities that I started out in. But because I've been in so many different communities, I think it gives me a chance to kind of translate some of the wisdom I've gained from different groups and into the language that another group could receive. And I think that's so much of that is the problem is that within like an evangelical context, a word like climate change has so many political connotations and identity tensions around it. It's hard to like speak to someone if there's like a wall that comes up. It comes with all this other baggage around it. So yeah, I found support, but not always in the places I was hoping to find it.
So I think importantly, the work that you've done in some ways is pushing back against that. It's helping people, I think, to take down those walls enough to actually open their hearts and minds to new perspective. You are helping people in churches who may not know how to speak about these issues. He may not know enough about the issues even to be conversant. So could you tell us about the general framework of liturgies and counter-liturgies that organizes the material?
You start from the point that you can agree with, which is that God is at the center and that this is about worshiping God. And how can we do that better in community as whole people and extend that vision of worship, not just to this is what we do on Sunday mornings by singing hymns, but that worshiping God is every aspect of our lives and is our vocation and encompasses our vocation in the sense of whether we're a healthcare worker or a biologist or a writer or a pastor or a plumber or a homemaker, that we can cultivate habits that turn us more toward God. So we started from that point. So that's the first liturgy. And the idea of liturgies and counter liturgies is that there's these stories that society tells us about who God or who we are and who we are in relation to the earth. And then like, where are we going and in our collective life together, which often has been the term doom scrolling, has been so kind of a spiral of despair and bad news and fear. And then saying, well, these are the stories that we hear, and these are the habits and the postures that these stories bring out in us. Tribalism, like a sense of independence and wanting to master and control things, just a constant seeking of novelty and fear of missing out of the next new thing, wanting to be entertained, and then just general despair and kind of like directionlessness and apathy. And then saying, well, what are the stories that our faith tells us about who we are? And then what are the habits and postures of heart that come out of that? And then working backwards and saying, well, we know these are the stories, these are the truths that we want to be living out on a day-to-day basis, but we can't live them out without concrete action. So what habits can we practice to form ourselves into people that really live that story and embody that story? In the context of Au Sable Institute and the vision for serving, protecting, and restoring God's earth, we felt like our call as worshipers of God has to be put in relationship with our call to care for creation, to serve and keep creation, as it says in Genesis. And so how can we be doing these things together and see ourselves not just as part of a divine community, a human community, but the community of creation and in relationship with creation as we worship God?
I'm curious about the title, Liturgies of Restoration. Particularly, what does that word restoration mean?
In the past, I thought of that as like going back, like to like, what was it like in Eden? And that was the perfect, thing that God made that was perfect. And now things are broken and there's sin and death. My experiences with chronic illness and having a body that doesn't always work according to what I think I would like it to work like, and knowing that it might not ever go back to that original state, if there is such a thing as an original state, has pushed me to rethink about what wholeness and restoration might be when we have wounds and we have sustained wounds. I like to think about a mosaic. When something is broken, you put the pieces together, it might not look like what it did originally, but out of the creativity and kind of partnership with God that God is inviting us to, we're not just like taking some blueprint that he had that we're just like blindly following, but we're bringing our God-given talent and creativity and imagination to the work to do something different and new that might not look like the original thing, but I think is better than the original thing. And I think about the stories in Revelation, the visions and images that we have aren't of going back to the garden, but of Jerusalem, the holy city, coming down to earth. So like a garden city almost. And so there's this new complexity and God taking things that were broken and transforming them into something more beautiful. So I like to think of it as like a progress, not just like going back to original state.
You mentioned chronic illness and struggling with that. In some ways, it seems to me that's a pretty powerful metaphor for the broader work of healing brokenness, dealing with brokenness in the greater world. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that creativity. Are there ways that you have personally had to re-story and reinterpret where your life is going when it doesn't go in expected directions?
Definitely. I think if I stayed in the place of telling myself the story that this is not the way things should be, and I think that's it's very tempting to do when it comes to looking at the ecological brokenness that we see and saying this is bad. The earth and the soil and the water and the air is so impure, and I just want to go back to something that's pure and unblemished. It feels a little hopeless to think about doing that. What I've learned through having to face ongoing brokenness is that you have to learn to be present and be present to the pain in order to kind of see the potential out of those situations that seem really hopeless. And I feel like that's something that I carry with me into like ecological work too, as much as I kind of get stuck in that place of, oh, this is not what God intended. We've really messed things up. And I think that's true. I think I sense God also calling me to just be present and enjoy, just see the good in the moment, and also to see maybe that we're placed here for such a time as this, like a sense of like divine calling and purpose for this moment in our collective human history. I think pleasure and enjoyment is like key to the work that we do. So if we're not able to just absorb the goodness, I think we can't do the next step. So that it starts from that place of just saying, wow, this is amazing and good, just the way it is. And I want to be part of the next thing that God has for my body, for this world.
Could you talk about your hopes for this workbook in terms of the impact that you would like to see it have?
I'd love to see more churches, maybe if there's just one person in the church that cares about these topics, cares about how our worship is also includes creation care, environmental stewardship, bring this workbook to the church to start a conversation, to start from that point of worship and go outward from there. And I think it's a really easy entry. You know, it's 5 weeks, so it's pretty low investment as far as getting organizational buy-in or support for that, for a small group or whatever. And even if it's not through church, having a group of friends who share that common faith. And I want to find a supportive space to talk about these concerns that they haven't found. I'd love to see it used in a variety of contexts.
One of our recent guests actually has started a movement called Wild Church Movement or Wild Church Network. And it consists of churches that take very seriously this idea that creation is revelation, that we learn about God, we perceive God in nature if we have eyes to see. And she contends that while established churches, as you say, do need to be talking about these issues, the youth aren't necessarily going to be there to listen. She sees a possible way forward where new communities are being formed that prioritize creation at the center of their liturgies, really. And those are the churches that she thinks are going to attract people back to have some interest in a community reflection or a community expression of worship to God. I read the liturgies in the book, and to me they seem compelling and persuasive and non-threatening, in the sense that you could read this book, you could walk through the liturgies with a group and not feel like someone is trying to change you, not feel like someone is trying to shift you politically. It's a very gentle and graceful invitation to see things that you didn't see before. And the question I had as I was reading that, it made me think, is there hope in this particular volume, in this particular workbook, for churches that have become stuck in a more conservative, we'll say, stance, the sort of anti-climate change mentality? Is there hope that people might be changed by this workbook?
Yeah, it's so hard to bridge those gaps. And as we all know, in the United States, they've gotten so deep. The divides have gotten so deep, and more divides seem to be popping up around all kinds of issues that weren't divisive before, that now are just like, oh, if you use these words or have this position, then you must not be on my side. I think we have to start from that posture of really believing they have the best intentions. Like, they want the same things. Like, we want the same things, which is a better world and a better future for our children and our children's children. And I do have hope. I tend to want to jump in at like the point of pointing fingers, but I'm learning more and more to jump in at the point of we're all humans and we have shared concerns.
It strikes me that this workbook is a pretty powerful tool, especially for those folks who feel alone, right? And a lot of the listeners to this podcast do feel like they are alone in believing that God lives in creation, that we have a responsibility to be good relatives to all elements of creation. This seems to me to be a tool around which they could organize some conversation and maybe find that they're not alone as they thought they might have been, or they can bring people to persuade them into that space that has an openness to those ideas. It's something that could give people courage to actually know how to speak about these issues, to enter into the conversation and invite other people into that conversation as well.
We have to offer a better way of living, something that is practical and actionable, that we can do hopefully with other people, not just alone. Being able to use this workbook in community, I think, would be the most productive and fruitful way to kind of envision, like, how can we live out these practices together.
We've been in conversation with author Liuan Huska. As I promised at the top of the episode, I want to give listeners an opportunity to sign up for a free, self-paced course that is based on Liuan's material. I highly recommend the course as an exercise of renewal and inspiration for living our lives as earthkeepers. And to echo Liuan's words, this would be a great course to do with a group of other people in the context of community. So, to get free access to the course, just go to the podcast website at earthkeepers.online and sign up for podcast updates using the link at the bottom of the homepage. Then I'll send you an email with the info that you need to access the course. The Earthkeepers podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization committed to cultivating a more ecologically conscious faith. For more information about the podcast, or to learn about the ways you can support this work, go to our website at earthkeepers.online. You can contact us by leaving a voicemail through the podcast website, or by emailing us at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. I am Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. James Amadon is our executive producer. Our content editor and researcher is Colleen Megerly, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director, and Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music. Thank you for listening, friends, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.